Welcome to Manufacturing Talk Radio. I'm Tim Grady, and I am here with Nancy LeMaster, who is the committee chair for the Hospital Report on Business from the Institute for Supply Management, which is why you see that ISM background behind her. We always enjoy talking with Nancy because she gives us a boots on the ground feel for what is happening with this COVID pandemic. Hopefully we'll soon get into a epidemic so the pandemic piece floats away and we'll all be getting healthier and feeling better about our economy. Nancy, welcome back to Manufacturing Talk Radio.
Thank you, Tim, for having me.
Always love to have you on the show. We know that the hospitals are kind of the linchpin point of what's happening with the pandemic. How are they doing?
Well, March was quite a month of transition. If you looked at the PMI, it came in at 50.4, down 6.5%. That's actually the lowest PMI we've had since April of 2020, when the pandemic was just starting. And if you remember, we kind of emptied out the hospitals in anticipation of a huge wave of COVID patients. And then there was that little bit of lag before they came. So we're actually seeing a really dramatic decrease in volume this month. In fact, the business activity number went into contracting. It went down 10% to 44. And again, like I said, those levels haven't been that low since that April, May 2020 timeframe. So a really dramatic change. Again, remember, it's month over month. It's a leading indicator. Right. Hospitals aren't empty, trust me, but they saw a dramatic decline. And in fact, new orders also went into contracting mode, down to 46. Again, we saw, oops, sorry about that. My mistake, I should have turned that off. So we saw new orders really go down significantly into the contracting range. Again, we saw that a little bit when we made the transition from Delta to Omicron in January 2021. But if you remember, those two variants overlap somewhat. So what we're seeing now is the fact that the Omicron has really loosened its grip. The hospitals are emptying out, but luckily, we have not seen the BA.2 variant result in another upswing of hospitalizations. So that is good. We also saw a decline in the backlog of orders. That went down 12.5% to 56. It's still growing, but it's down. And what I'm really attributing that to, based on the comments, were the fact that many of our panelists said they were not able to staff to full capacity. So even though we're emptying out from COVID, which is a good thing, we're not seeing the backfill come in of the electives as quickly as we thought it might initially. So we kind of know that there's a backlog of demand, but the ability to funnel that demand in is being constrained by primarily labor constraints. In fact, the employment, though, was growing again this month at 53, pretty much stable. It was 53.5 last month. So, we are seeing that it is in growth mode, but just barely. We've only had it in growth mode a couple of months. So what we're really seeing is Omicron loosened its grip. We're not seeing the influx of electives, but we don't really think that they've gone away. And we think that, in some ways, capacity is constrained by labor. In some cases, you just don't flip a switch and empty out of one kind of patient and fill up with another. So, we'll see what April brings on the volume front. I would expect it to come back, but you never know. So that's kind of the volume story. The volume story is a little bit different than the supply story. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I would like to know how the supply chain managers are doing in the hospitals. I am fascinated when talking with Tim Fiore on the manufacturing side, Anthony Nieves on the services side, how big a piece supply chain is when you look at any of these things, including hospitals.
Right. Supply chain is, supplies are your second largest expense, obviously, in a hospital. And you just think of the breadth, you've got everything from, toilet paper to intravenous drugs and everything in between that it takes to run a hospital. And we saw a really pretty significant improvement in supplier deliveries. Now they're still slow, but the number dropped from 71 to 58.5. That's a 12.5% drop. And the last time that the number was at 58 was back in November of 2020. So it's been a long time that supplier delivery number has been in the 60s and 70s. The comments were mixed. You definitely still had some of the supply chain professionals talking about, the back orders and the delays, et cetera. But overall, the numbers suggested that, relatively speaking, they were seeing improvement. And that followed through into their inventory behavior. So if you remember, for the last kind of 7 months, even though sentiment often was saying, we think our inventory is too high, they were still growing their inventories. And they were saying it was because of the uncertainty, the back orders, the increase in COVID, so many concerns. But in March, that inventory was reduced. It went into contracting, dropped 15.5%. So we went from 56 to 40.5. That is dramatic. So that tells me that, obviously we saw a volume decline. So, okay, you don't need as many supplies, right, if your patient volume is down. But I think more than anything, the combination of deliveries getting, relatively speaking, a little bit better, volume decreasing, and the fact that the supply chain professionals know they need to reduce inventory, they were just buffering. We may start to see a little bit of improvement there. So, and inventory sentiment is still that it's too high, but this was the first time in several months that we've had a correlation where they actually said it's too high and we're actively cutting back. So we also saw a decrease in imports that went into contraction mode, went from 54.5 to 47. So just that piece, Tim, tells me that there's a little optimism out there that maybe things are starting to get better. Now, in the comments, there were comments worrying about China doing another lockdown because of COVID concerns there, uncertainty about the Ukraine war. Certainly not saying we're out of the woods, but at least for 1 month, we had a little reprieve. No reprieve on the pricing though, just like you saw with Tim and Tony when you talked with them. Pricing remains very high. In growth mode, although it grew a little bit slower this month. So we'll take any little bit of good news. Pricing overall was at 73, down 2.5%, and we saw a slight decline in pharmacy pricing, 58 versus 61, and supplies 71 versus 75.5. So we saw a little softening, but those are still very high levels. And it's been over 2 years since we've seen any price decreases since before COVID. So a lot of pricing pressure, a lot of labor cost pressure on the hospitals right now.
Nancy, I'm just curious, I don't know if you'll have this at your fingertips, but I'll ask. In the pricing category, I know that in the manufacturing and particularly the services side, which includes retail, if prices go up until demand drops, and then prices either stabilize or begin to decline. What causes prices to either stabilize or decline in the hospital sector?
Well, there's a lot of somewhat similarities there. Again, competition, if we've got enough competition, I always say we need at least 3 suppliers to generate any sort of competition in the pricing range, and demand will sometimes bring it back down. Pricing is very difficult to bring down in the hospital environment. It seems like, you asked 1 month when I was talking about pharmaceuticals being so high, and I said, well, they raise their prices every January and July. And you said, why do they do that? I said, because they can. Many are sole sources. It's very hard, other than, what hospitals spend a lot of time looking at is utilization. Are we utilizing the most cost-effective supply? Are we using it in the right way? Likewise with pharmaceuticals. So a lot of times, because hospitals can't directly impact the price of the item, they look at how to modify the utilization to reduce their costs. But we would look to the same factors of competition and demand. If we can reduce our demand, if COVID stays under control and our demand for PPE comes down, the supply goes up. It's the same dynamic there.
Nancy, do some of the hospitals, particularly maybe the rural hospitals, use generics in place of name brands to keep their costs down?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think across all hospitals, you've got whether it be generic drugs, where we're constantly looking at, do we have that opportunity? When do we have that opportunity? When does something go off patent and we can move? Or again, we compare supplies. You've got a brand name, and then you maybe have a private label product. So distributors and group purchasing organizations often develop private label products that you would then compare with a brand name. So a big part of what goes on is evaluating that quality, evaluating when is it more cost effective to use a generic. Pretty much an ongoing process that supply chain professionals do on a regular basis.
I'm just curious also in the hospital sector, is maybe different from the other two sectors. The comments tend to be a little more unique. What are you reading from your respondents and how they feel things are at the moment?
Yeah, so I think that there's a lot of hesitancy right now. I mean, we've been through this how many times where it seems like COVID retracts, and then we, 2 months later, we get hit again with another variant, another wave. So I really sense some trepidation of are we kind of there this time? Will the combination of vaccinations and building some immunity, plus the fact that we now have the antiviral, the oral treatment to give to people when they are diagnosed, to potentially keep them from getting sick enough to be in the hospital. I mean, that's the one hand of, okay, is that going to hold? And then how do we bring back these electives? So I see it as a time where, people kind of want to exhale, but they're not there yet. And the storm clouds, like I said, with China and the Russia-Ukraine war, have people worried that we're just not there in terms of getting the supply chain untangled, where we could then finally maybe get some relief on pricing. So I would put it as, somewhere between hesitant and maybe cautiously optimistic that we can smooth things out. I just think that, some of these long trends are really long-term trends, like we've talked about, and I know Tim has talked about, the labor pool isn't going to fully bounce back. We've had a significant number of retirements. This is a problem before the pandemic, but the pandemic really brought it to light that, we have a declining population. And if we don't also have any immigration and we have a declining population, where are the workers going to come from? And so I think a lot of hospitals are spending a lot of time, probably like other industries, really looking at how can we start influencing kids in junior high and in high school to think about a career in healthcare, and how do we do a better job of creating training programs for some of these. Obviously, you need very formal education programs for pharmacists and doctors and nurses, but we have a lot of technical positions, and how do we make sure that we're growing the base of potential employees?
Yes, that's going to be a challenge. As you say, we do have a shrinking population. That's just kind of the first time this has occurred in the United States in living memory. Right. So it'll be a significant challenge. Has there been any improvement that you've been able to uncover in terms of healthcare workers being able to work on one side of St. Louis and then cross the river and work on the other side of St. Louis, which happens to be in Illinois versus Missouri?
No, not really, not seriously. I think there are some individual states that are making it. It is part of a recommendation that the American Hospital Association made to Congress, in terms of, we've been talking about the idea that there are a variety of kind of what I call public-private initiatives going on, where the government is looking and talking to various organizations, professional organizations, to look at how we can improve the supply chain long-term for another pandemic. And, you know, I think the discussions are good, but we need to then kind of get them beyond the discussion phase to some pilot projects. So I know that it's, you know, kind of in checking back, I'm not really hearing about any projects yet, but at least the dialogue is continuing to happen about how do we actually improve the strategic stockpile. How do we do a better job of, do we incent onshoring of manufacturing and make it more than a crisis response, but make it sustainable, ongoing. I think those conversations are happening. Again, I'll feel better when I see a few pilot projects out there.
Yes, I would agree. Certainly, it's not particularly easy to come up with a national policy in anything. Right. And a national health care certification where I could work in any state in the union will take, I'm sure, several years to develop. And then they have to begin to get people qualified under the new certification. And so, yeah, it's not a flash in the pan fix. We wish it were, but it's not.
Yeah, that's true. That is true. You know, in looking at the hospital metrics for the month, I think the most dramatic metric change we saw was in that case mix index. That's the index that kind of tells you how sick your patients are. And that dropped into contracting. It hasn't been there since May of 2020, dropped 12.5%, 55.5 to 43. Again, it just further reinforces the shifting of COVID patients out of the hospital without a significant backfill of elective surgeries. So, but that was a really big decline. And that's an index that doesn't usually change significantly month to month. So that was a big deal. And so that really reinforced what we saw in the volume, was that we saw an outpouring of sick patients that were on ventilators and ICUs, recovering enough to get out of those units and then ultimately go home. And in some ways good that we didn't see those replaced, but the hospitals do need to get those replaced with, like I said, that elective volume. That's where a lot of their profit margins come from. We know from Kaufman Hall, the organization that monitors hospital profitability, they reported negative margins for both January and February for hospitals. So that's concerning. We need to not make that a trend.
Right, right. Well, this has been a very, I hate to call it volatile, because it's not volatile in a bad way, but there are some significant changes within the sub-indexes of this report.
Yeah, there have been. So we're anxious to see what April brings about. I hope that it brings about, you know, the ability to start taking care of some of those folks that have had to postpone care because of the lack of availability of resources, and we'll see what April brings us.
And certainly what I'd like the listeners and viewers to take away from this is that when Nancy's talking about elective procedures, some of those elective procedures are radiation and chemotherapy treatment. I mean, it's serious stuff. It's not, I'm just going in to get my my under eye tucked to death.
Yes, and that often, I kind of dislike the word elective because it doesn't really get at the fact that, you know, in many cases, these patients are in severe pain. You know, they may be having a cancerous tumor that can't be removed. Yeah, they're serious procedures, you know, they just are not life-threatening. That's really the difference. If they're not life-threatening, then they're considered elective.
Interesting. Well, Nancy, again, thank you for being with us. We appreciate you sharing the details of the Hospital Purchasing Managers Index report. The whole supply chain issue is fascinating and it leapt to the forefront in this pandemic period. It was kind of getting some recognition before then, but now it's really recognized as a key component in any business or industry. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Tim.
And we will be back next month with Nancy as we do another Hospital Purchasing Managers Index report. You can find the report at ismworld.org. And while you are surfing the web, please stop by jacketmediaco.com where you will find this episode and all of the shows that Jacket Media produces, including the WHAM podcast, Hazard Girls, and some very interesting monthly shows that are both up and some on the horizon. Stay tuned, and thank you for joining us on this episode of Manufacturing Talk Radio.